Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction, and welcome to the fifth part of my ongoing series, The Animated 80s. It's a good video day, as I don't have any corrections or apologies to make, no bad news or format changes, nothing but cartoons. That being said, I'd like to encourage you all again to check my Instagram for more animation goodness. This week I'm covering 1987's Spiral Zone over there as my tune of the week. And as usual, if you love all things animated in 80s, then like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, which can only lead to more animated goodness for all. Now, without further ado, on to 1984.
Yeah, it's a bit much.
As usual, we'll start this video with a recap of how last year went. I think a great way to sum it up in the most 80s way possible is to say that 1983 was radical, both in terms of animation and just in terms of it being radically different from the years before.
It's a homonym.
I made the statement that 83 was the true start of the 80s, and it didn't seem to be too controversial for any of you, so I guess that I'll take that as agreement. 1983 saw the end, for the most part, of the vaudevillian-style variety shows and the marquee multi-bill shows, and focused almost exclusively on standalone shows. It's also the year that saw the first hints of the 80s action formula, with team-based, large-cast action series packed with new iconography and earworm lines of dialogue.
Yo, Joe!
By the power of Grayskull!
It was a banner year for animation in the 80s, and I think I can speak for us all when I say that there's little to nothing to complain about there. It'll be fun going forward to use 1983 as a benchmark and see how other years stack up. Make your predictions now in the comments below. Well, because I feel like I've found a good structure for this series, I'll stick to it by taking a look at the survivors from previous years. 1984 still saw some hangers-on from 1980, with Hanna-Barbera's World of Super Adventure, the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show, and Fat Albert all still on the air. We also got the return of a show from 79 to 81, with the long-awaited third season of Star Blazers, though it unfortunately only aired in a few select markets, mostly in Northern California. The only holdouts from 1981 were the Daffy Speedy show in its Sylvester Tweety Daffy Speedy format, and the Smurfs, which, spoiler, will be with us for the rest of the decade. 1982's only survivor was already a zombie, with it being the Flintstone Funnies, which played reruns of older shows. And lastly, the 1983 lineup we talked about last video, well, all but 4 of them continued into this year. So which 4 fell by the wayside? To be honest, nothing that anyone would probably miss too much. From the 1983 lineup, we lost the Biscuits, but we still had the Smurfs. We lost the Dukes, but we still had the live-action version. We lost the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show, but as you'll see shortly, immediately replaced it. And lastly, lost Rubik the Amazing Cube. So essentially, we lost nothing we didn't already have a substitute for, other than Rubik, which kept our attention about as long as the actual toy did. All in all, it wasn't a bad year for casualties. So what did we get to go along with all of these continuing series? A whole hell of a lot, that's what. There were 21 new series premiering this year, and the lineup was pretty stacked. I'm not going to read out all the titles here, as we'll cover most of them in the upcoming sections, but rest assured that there were some real gems in this batch, and they almost universally continued to build on the progress started in 1983. We're going to drill down and see exactly what we were dealing with this year, and I want to start with some talk about the media cross-pollination that started ramping up in 1984. Let's take a look at music in video games. In a pretty unique and interesting way that it never had before, music started to work its way into Saturday mornings this year. I mean, music had always had a place in cartoons, but normally it was music that existed internally to whatever series it came from. After all, Josie and the Pussycats played their own music, not top 40 hits. But with the continued and growing success of MTV since its launch in 1981, music had become an integral part of 80s culture in a way it never had before. It was easier than ever to not only hear our favorite artists, but constantly see them and follow their antics. So guess what? Cartoons started bringing that same access to kids in the form of Kid Video and Wolf Rock TV. Both series combined animation with real-world music videos integrated directly to their storylines. The 80s was in a lot of ways all about counterculture, and these shows were kind of like a chance to dip our toes into it. And then we've got video games. Although Atari almost killed the whole industry in America with the video game crash of 1983, that didn't stop us from not only getting 2 new series based on them, but getting one that took the most basic concept in all of gaming with Cargo Fast and expanding that into a pretty awesome action series that I'd personally forgotten about until a couple months ago when I started working on this series. This year brought us Dragon's Lair, based on the game of the same name and simply expanding the adventures of Dirk the Daring that were set up there, but without the cheap deaths and quarter lust of the arcade machines. But we also got Pole Position, which took a simple racing game and turned it into a spy story with transforming cars and complicated artificial intelligence and a mystery plot throughout. It did a lot with a super basic concept, and it did it really well. I've mentioned, well, let's be honest, quite a bit, the series up to this point in the decade that we got from Japan. Well, we got some of those this year too that we'll chat about shortly. But for the first time in the 80s, we also turned our attention to the Atlantic and brought over a couple of series from Europe. Okay, well, not the first time. I guess that would have been the Smurfs. Appropriate, since another of the series I was about to mention here was originally Belgian too. Lucky Luke was based off a Belgian comic book series, co-produced by Hanna-Barbera and a French company, Gaumont, for simultaneous release in the US and France, and set exclusively in the American Wild West frontier. Ironic, right? It wasn't the first cowboy show we had in the 80s, as that honor goes to the Lone Ranger, and it wouldn't be the last, as you'll see in future videos, but considering its origins, it was one of the most interesting. But what I really meant, and probably should have said when I made my comment about the first cartoon we got from Europe, is that we got our first cartoon from the UK, and it was awesome. I'd never seen a single episode of Lucky Luke, but I've watched quite a few of the British super spy Danger Mouse. It originally aired in the UK in 1981 and ran there for 11 seasons, but it came to us here in 1984 and lasted for quite a long time on RTVs as well, across various channels. It's a great show, and I highly recommend it. Another thing that happened this year, and was kind of a first for animation, was the drawing of gender lines in the animated sand. Toy Aisles had always had G.I. Joe on this side and Barbie on that one configurations that continue to this day. But before 1984, I don't think there were any cartoons that I could point to and empirically say, girls only. That all changed this year with the premiere of Rainbow Bright. Now, I personally don't think that creative properties need to be so clearly delineated, and as the father of girls myself, you can probably imagine how shattered those boy-toy battle lines were in my home. But for better or worse, this trend was pervasive in the 80s, and it started here. Sure, there was and would continue to be plenty of middle ground like Heathcliff, but there was also a healthy dose of boys watch this, girls watch that throughout the rest of the decade. It's kind of a black spot in the year and the decade in general, but it was important, and I thought it deserved a mention here. But now back to our regularly scheduled fan-personing about 80s cartoons and 80s anime specifically. This year saw some of the best things we stole from Japan come to our airwaves in the form of Voltron, Challenge of the GoBots, and the Transformers, as well as the aforementioned third season of Star Blazers. Voltron, like Force 5 before it, was an amalgamation of a couple different Japanese cartoons. However, instead of showing them in an anthology-type format like Force 5 did, Voltron was made by smashing them together like action figures in a sandbox. Well, maybe not as egregiously as they may have merged some other shows in the 80s, but it was a smashing together of various series nonetheless, with Beast King Go Lion serving as the foundation for Lion Force Voltron, and Armored Fleet Die Ruger 15 being the building blocks of the Vehicle Force, which we'll revisit next year. GoBots, on the other hand, didn't take a series wholesale from Japan, but rather just took some of the Japanese character designs from the Machine Robo toy line and repurposed them. In this instance, we Americans actually beat Japan to the punch with the animated series, and Machine Robo wouldn't get a series on that side of the ocean until 1986. And if you're interested, it's actually quite a bit better than the one we got. I promise, I don't hate the GoBots, I just see them for what they are, which here in America is a weak imitation of the Transformers in every conceivable way. But speaking of the Transformers, we also got them this year, and they were another one based on a Japanese toy line, specifically a spin-off of the 70s Microman called Diaclone. In the toy line, they were more like mechs than autonomous robots, but the American production team took the concept and ran wild with it. That's why those original G1 Transformer toys had driver's seats, so there was someplace to put the Diaclone figures that they no longer came with. But just like with GoBots, Japan liked what America was doing here and adopted the series wholeheartedly themselves, even continuing the story after it went off the air here in the US. Not that, as I'm sure you're all well aware, it stayed gone very long. Lastly, though, not only did we get these series based on Japanese toy lines and series, but we also got one that was wholly American and just based on Japanese concepts. Kind of. The Mighty Orbots was a combining robot story focusing on 5 autonomous robots and their nerdy inventor who, in times of emergency, would combine to form Mighty Orbots. I say it was kind of wholly American, but it was created in collaboration with a Japanese production company called TMS Entertainment, and it was also directed by a Japanese anime director named Osamu Dezaki. Oh, and it was also the target of a lawsuit by Tonka for being too similar to and causing confusion with GoBots, so I guess it was hardly American at all. Well, damn. Here I was hoping we'd made something robot-oriented without having to lean on Japan, but I guess that'll have to wait until later in the decade. So we've already covered a bunch of shows, and most of them were awesome. But what else could 1984 possibly offer? Quite a bit, honestly. Like I mentioned in the Remember the Fallen section, we lost one Scooby-Doo series this year, but it was replaced with 2 others, the New Scooby-Doo Mysteries and Scary Scooby Funnies. The latter was a repackaging of stories that ran in the Richie Rich Scooby-Doo show from 1980 to 81, but the other was all new stories, and it brought Daphne back into the series. I know that I said that in the video for last year, and full disclosure, this isn't really a new show. It's actually just a renaming of last year's The New Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show. I was hoping by pretending that removing Scrappy from the title would speed up his removal from the series as well, but no luck, I guess. It was a good sign of things to come, though. G.I. Joe came back for a second round with another miniseries called The Revenge of Cobra, again airing for just a single week this year from September 10th to the 14th. Side note, if you haven't watched my cartoonical analysis on the Mass device, then you should. I think it's pretty good, if I do say so myself. We also got several other new series, including the return of Heathcliff, this time supported by a group of characters called the Cadillac Cats, which actually directly integrated with the main series. We got a new version of a classic character in the form of Pink Panther and Sons, and on a non-animated note, if you haven't seen any of Peter Sellers' live-action Pink Panther movies, they're pretty hilarious and great. We got more Looney Tunes in the form of the Bugs Bunny Looney Tunes Comedy Hour. We got a new Super Friends in the form of Super Friends, the Legendary Superpowers show, which finally brought in some of my favorite DC characters with Green Lantern and Firestorm. We got an underwater take on the Smurfs with the Snorks. Nickelodeon threw their hat in the animation ring as they moved from premium to cable this year with the Get Along Gang, a show made to placate the angry moms of the decade, though CBS took the show away following its successful premiere. And we got a cartoon based on what is probably the absolute weirdest concept to come out of the entire decade, Turbo Teen, about a kid who gets merged with his car and then turns back and forth into his car, depending on how hot or cold he gets. But most importantly of these leftovers, at least for me, we got Muppet Babies. I watched the hell out of this show as a kid, especially as I loved the live-action Muppets. It was such a great show and so much different than almost anything else of its time. It crossed several genre lines, incorporated tons of pop culture, and was just generally amazing. I know I'm an action animation channel at heart, and those series do hold a special place for me, but so does Muppet Babies. If you haven't seen it, the original 80s version that is, I have no idea what that remake's about. Do yourself a favor and track it down. You won't be disappointed. And that's it for all of the new content that came to us in 1984. I was leaving kindergarten and entering first grade this year, so I was right at the start of my real 80s animation journey. And what a journey it was. Fortunately, a lot of the series from this year can still be watched, too. There are a couple that are hard to come by, including Wolf Rock TV, which is essentially completely lost, Turbo Teen, and Pink Panther and Sons, most of which can probably be found here on YouTube, the Bugs Bunny Looney Tunes Comedy Hour, which, honestly, it consisted of Looney Tunes skits, so you can find those any number of places, and most unfortunately of all, Muppet Babies. The pop culture references that I mentioned this show had included several movie clips throughout, which makes reproducing it a nightmare legal minefield. Kid Video kind of falls into that same category as it contained a lot of actual live-action music videos throughout the series. You'll have to dig for those nuggets of gold. Plenty of the others can be watched on streaming or DVD though, including the new Scooby-Doo Mysteries, which you can watch with a Boomerang sub, and Pole Position, which is available for purchase on Vudu. Dragon Slayer, Mighty Orbots, The Get Along Gang, Challenge of the GoBots, Heathcliff, G.I. Joe, Lucky Luke, Rainbow Bright, Super Friends, the Legendary Superpowers show, Voltron, The Transformers, Snorks, and Danger Mouse can all be picked up on DVD as of May 2023 at Well, let's just call it a wide range of price points. You can find Amazon links for them in the description if you want to pick up your own copies. And that's it for 1984. Talk about giving 83 a run for its money. Not only was everything great about that year still present here, but it was added to with classics like the Transformers and Voltron, both of which are best of the 80s contenders. Years like this are going to make my promised ranking at the end of this series quite the endeavor. But how do you feel about this year and the series that have brought us? Let me know your thoughts on the year, the shows, and anything else you want to talk about in the comments below. This series remains a ton of fun for me to make, and I hope you're all feeling the same way watching it. Don't forget to look at my channel homepage to find the playlists of all this year's intros. Like, subscribe, and check me out on Instagram if you've been enjoying the content. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in 1985. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.